So now I want to discuss the question of the Scottish referendum from a Muslim perspective, and I'm sharing this again in a spirit of love and hopefully goodwill, just simply trying to get to the truth as I can see it. And just to explain, I've been involved in Islamic studies for many years at quite a senior level. Obviously, as part of my degree at the University of London, I studied Middle Eastern politics in great detail, including the Balkans region and the whole Ottoman Empire, and have travelled widely throughout the Balkans and in Morocco and Israel and Palestine, and about to go to Turkey and Istanbul. Now, I've been interested in Islam for many years as a philosopher of religion, and particularly in Sufism, which is a tradition I've spent many years studying and to some extent practicing. I taught at the Muslim College in London under Dr. Zaki Badawi for several years, and have met many senior Muslim scholars from around the world, from the Arab world, the Turkish community, from North Africa, from Egypt, and from India, and worked in interfaith relations with Muslim scholars. Now, obviously, my understanding of Islam is that it's fundamentally a peace-loving religion, and having studied the life of Muhammad in very great detail, and the early caliphs and the early descendants of the Prophet, and both the Sunni and the Shia traditions of Islam, and the other branches of Islam, Ismaili, and so on. It is my conclusion that Islam is absolutely a peace-loving religion, and the violence that it's sadly sometimes associated with is fundamentally due to a misreading of the Quran and a misreading of the Hadith, and a misunderstanding which goes back to conflicts, to splitting that occurred very early on in the Islamic community. It was brewing even before the death of Muhammad, and conflicts between Aisha, his last wife, who was quite young, very young when he married her, and then Ali, who was his chief lieutenant and son-in-law, married to his daughter Fatima. There was a personality clash and a power clash between Aisha and Ali that already brewed in the lifetime of Muhammad, and tragically after his death, it led to serious problems, and eventually to conflict and open struggle and violence, and eventually concretized in the form of the Shia-Sunni split, which still bedevils Islam right up to this day. Now, this split that occurred in Islam is really regarded as the tragedy that affected Islam by all serious scholars who got into this. And I've spoken to philosophers of Islam, people like Sayyid Hossein Nasr and others, and if you read the writings of all serious Islamic scholars and historians of philosophy, they will say, the greatest tragedy that befell Islam and why it has been bedeviled by conflict internally, why we're looking at conflict in Iraq and Syria and other Islamic states, is because of this unresolved conflict between the Shias and the Sunnis. The true Muslims, in my opinion, stand above and beyond that conflict, and they would be the Sufis, the philosophers, the sages. And they're sadly not given as much publicity and not given as much preeminence. But if you really go into Islamic philosophy and history, as I have done, and as other scholars have done, you will, I think, confirm what I'm saying here. A true Muslim is someone who is going to be submitted to the absolute, and their will be blended in harmony with the will behind the entire cosmos, the universe, and they regard the revelations of the Quran received through Muhammad as a guidance on how to surrender, align and adjust one's will to that divine harmony. And it's not about fear, it's not about threats, it's not about terror, it's about joy and love. One submits to the absolute because one loves the universe, one loves the creator of the universe, because one loves God as the beloved, as the source. We all know as humans the experience of loving each other as special partners, consorts, husbands, wives, families, children, etc. But imagine loving the source of all that. So the intensity of the love that a true Muslim or a sage feels for the creator of the universe is enormous. And the one thing that I think a Muslim surely should struggle against, and this is the inner meaning of the word jihad. Jihad doesn't mean fighting for, a kind of religion like a club, like a tribal identity. It doesn't mean, careering around on the battlefield to promote one's own tribe or religion at the expense of others, who are genuine believers in their own light and their own revelations. A true Muslim would engage in interfaith dialogue and mutual respect, and I've met many great Muslim scholars who've been engaged in these philosophical dialogues. I've just been in Cordoba in Spain discussing the work of Ibn Arabi and Ibn Rushd and these great mystics and scientists and philosophers from the past. They didn't engage in violent polemics. They engaged in rational, humble dialogue towards ultimate truth. Now, so I think splitting and breaking up polities and countries is to be engaged in by Muslims with very, very great caution. If you look at what's happening in Syria at the moment, it's an absolute, utter, total tragedy. I've been trying to communicate with the Foreign Office an alternative way of peace making, that Britain and the UK and the Commonwealth and the European Union could actually be intervening as mediators in this tragic civil war that's going on. I don't believe we should be taking sides with this or that faction. We should be saying, look, it's in the best interests of the Mediterranean region as a whole, of the Middle East as a whole, that peace should come to Syria. And we shouldn't be taking sides with this or that faction. Certainly not extreme Muslim factions that are promoting violence and a misunderstanding of the concept of jihad. Now, and I would say the same in other Islamic states such as Iraq and Afghanistan. I think Britain should have been pursuing a peace policy here. And this is something I've advocated for the last 10, 15 years. Now, when it comes to the Scottish referendum on independence, I can't see that a Muslim would wish to separate the United Kingdom into separate pieces and help dismember what has succeeded as a state and a country and a civilization for many centuries, and for good and ill has ruled a large part of the world, and for many years helped, as it were, keep the peace and moderate the cultures of large parts of the Middle East, of Iraq and of Egypt and Sudan and all the way through to India and Pakistan. And there was a great respect between Islamic civilization and British civilization. Many scholars, many founders of Islamic countries came to Britain. They studied at Cambridge or Oxford, like the founders of Pakistan. And many great poets, many philosophers have studied in British institutions of higher learning. And in Scotland as well, there have been great centres for Islamic studies at the University of Edinburgh with H.R. Gibb and Montgomery Watt. You know, some of the greatest scholars on Quran and Islamic studies have been from Scotland and working in academia here. But also, there are great centres of Islamic expertise in Oxford and Cambridge and Exeter University and Lampeter and London University, particularly at SOAS. And at the Muslim College where I taught with Dr. Zaki Badawi. The question then, if you're a Muslim facing the choice, the difficult ethical choice of whether to vote for a new state coming into being, Scotland, and the breaking up of the United Kingdom, I would have thought that the United Kingdom as a whole can be of more help to advance the cause of peace and justice in the world in its integral state, kept together. I mean, there are quite a lot of Muslims living in Britain as a whole. There are over 1 million Muslims resident in the UK, and the very, very vast majority are highly industrious, learned, and highly, active citizens committed to helping the United Kingdom play its role in the world as a peace-loving and progressive country. and many senior Muslims engaged in interfaith dialogue have been active in helping British policy. Now, and one hears recently that some senior Muslims have been declaring the kind of jihadist element that think it's a great idea to go to Syria and fight against the government, and then maybe even to export those ideas back to Britain. Actually, moderate Muslims in Britain are beginning to speak out and say this is non-Islamic. As I say, as a philosopher, I would say that the point of Islam is an inner struggle for unity, and that requires, in a sense, appreciating the diversity of our being, understanding the complexity of the archetypes that we all embody, but then realizing that underlying them all there's a unity which is underscored and guaranteed by the Absolute, by Allah, by God. There is a kind of sovereign self, as Jung pointed out, behind the archetypes. And that is where God, as it were, the Absolute, Allah, speaks to us each individually. I think this is really a bit like a country. Each country is a microcosm of that. As Plato said, each polis mirrors the psyche. And yet, so the sovereign, in a sense, the image of the crown is the place at which that divine unity touches into our social beingness. And the absolute priority, I think, for a Muslim is to ensure peace and unity. Now, I've recently proposed, my Centre for Peace Policy Research has proposed, that one solution to the Israel-Palestine problem would be for Palestine as a whole, including Gaza and the West Bank, to join the Commonwealth, and for Commonwealth countries, including the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., to fund the rebuilding of their infrastructure, the rebuilding of a port, the rebuilding of a airport, and so on, and to help with the kinds of technological expertise that they're going to need as a state. The Commonwealth includes some states that have really emerged from trauma, like Rwanda, and has tremendous resources at its disposal. A huge number of Muslims live in Commonwealth countries, in India, in Malaysia, in Pakistan. Possibly, the largest political grouping on the planet of nation states that includes Islam would be the Commonwealth. And therefore it seems to me totally appropriate. And I've spoken to senior Palestinian officials. The representative in Britain, Afif Safieh, used to come to meetings of mine in Parliament back in the 90s, who said, look, it's policy of the Palestinian leaders that once independence comes, we would like to join the British Commonwealth. Well, I think this should be put up front and put higher up the agenda. And Commonwealth officials and governments should immediately begin to assist with mediation. And there should be a negotiated solution for the people of Gaza. A UN peacekeeping force, or maybe a Commonwealth peacekeeping force, should go in and protect both sides from each other and help keep peace, literally, which is what a peacekeeping force should do, between the Palestinians of Gaza and the Israelis. And the rockets and so on would have to cease and non-violence be adopted. So an independent state of Palestine, and a state declaring non-violence as its modality, could sign a lasting peace with an independent, autonomous, sovereign state of Israel, and both, as it were, recognise each other simultaneously. I've written about this. It's on Centre for Peace Policy Research. It seems to me the UK has the clout to pull that off in alliance with Commonwealth countries, and I think we have a moral duty to try and pull that off. The only people that I think who would oppose that would be extreme Islamic fanatics who in a sense don't want peace. They seem to want absolute violence ratcheted up to an extreme dimension, and in a sense are on a self-destruct mission. Perhaps, I don't know, perhaps some elements of Hamas or Al-Qaeda types see their mission as death or glory. If they can't, and they have this kind of fantasy they're going to sweep Israel into the sea and negate the last 50 years of history, and Israel will be no more, and they will ride their horses into Jerusalem and claim it as an Islamic city, etc., etc. And if not, then they're going to blow the whole thing up. Now, this is with all due respect, unethical, and unrealistic. I mean, it's heroic, it's romantic, it's kind of El Cid type stuff, but it's not actually going to happen. And what I'm proposing is an extremely pragmatic and concrete way of solving long-term the problems of Palestine and Gaza in a way that is in the interests of the whole world community, because the world is sick and tired of this ethical sore on the landscape. And I think we have to do our bit to solve it. I think we can do it. I've presented a proposal. I know that Canada, my home country, would be 100% behind this proposal and help fund it. It's in the interest of Canada as a nation sworn to peacekeeping and harmony in international relations to ensure that this kind of settlement would reach a successful conclusion. It's in the interest of Pakistan and India, because those are countries that, on the one hand, are sworn to helping their Islamic brethren, in the case of Pakistan, also in India, which has a huge population of Muslims. And the Palestinians are a wonderful people who don't deserve to be suffering in the way that they're doing. Now, if, on the other hand, the Muslims of Scotland say, well, actually, no, we don't want to do any of that kind of stuff. What we want is a totally independent Scotland, and our priority politically is to break up the UK, and we're going to get involved with Scottish nationalism. I despair, because it seems to me that this is a diversion of what authentic Islam is actually about. It's not about promoting the destruction of progressive, democratic, constitutionally peaceful and ordered states into unknown futures where, due to the essentially corruptible nature of politicians, there are inevitably going to be conflicts of status, prestige, money, power, and legal issues. If Scotland breaks away and decides to create its own state in law, it's going to fight every little detail of the treaty with civil servants and lawyers from Whitehall and from the UK. And we're going to see decades of wrangling and unpleasant bantering. These two sides can hardly talk to each other, it seems to me. They don't speak the same language. And there's going to be arguments about how much of the UK debt should be devolved to Scotland, how much of the UK assets, what to do about the UK Defence Forces, etc., etc. Pensions, social security bills. Now, meanwhile, the people of Gaza are burning, and the people of Palestine have no state to call their own. They have no security, and they have no human rights, really. And the people of Iraq are suffering and dying because their state was destroyed through I regard it as an illegal intervention by the US and UK governments on false and ignorant agendas. And I hold Tony Blair and George Bush Jr. personally responsible for this. I think they should be brought before an International Court of Justice. The Chilcot inquiry, which is still being quiet about all this, I look forward with great interest to its final publication, and I think this is a matter of moral concern for every UK citizen. Our armed forces were involved in interfering with the sovereignty of a country, and now we've left it in ruins. I hear regularly from churches in Baghdad and Iraq. In Mosul, there are Christians now being threatened with death unless they convert to Islam. And the girls are being forcibly genitally mutilated, given clitorectomies, as if that's some kind of a trait of Islam, which of course it isn't. It's barbarism and has nothing to do with authentic Islam. So where are the true teachers? Where are the true scholars and philosophers of Islam who can go and run the education system of Iraq? Iraq had some of the greatest scholars of Islam, and still does, hiding in the basements. What the UK should be doing is developing a genuine peace policy to help these countries to genuinely apologise for what was done in the name of this country, and by helping bring independence and autonomy and sovereignty to the people of Palestine, we would go some way towards making up this great wrong that was done, and also we would be helping the people of Israel. This isn't an anti-Israeli proposal. On the contrary, my friends in Israel, peace thinkers and philosophers and rabbis and Kabbalists, I've spoken there at conferences and have studied Judaism for many years, I think would be delighted, finally, if peace can be restored between Israel and Palestine and some kind of normality restored to relations between the two peoples. So I think a priority for Muslims and Sufis and all people interested in Islamic philosophy then, keep the country we have. It works pretty well. It needs tweaking. There are injustices. There are problems. Above all, let's get a genuine peace policy in this country. Let's get active in changing the thinking in Whitehall and the Foreign Office to peace thinking rather than militarised thinking. And let's try and advance that place of reconciliation. I mean, one of my long-term dreams for my Centre for Peace Policy Research is I would like to work with Muslim scholars, philosophers, sages and peace activists and have a conference maybe in Istanbul whereby we bring the Sunni and the Shia traditions together and make a formal peace treaty between them. It's time to heal this split. It's ridiculous. The scholars and philosophers on both sides know that it's blasphemous to retain a hatred for other kinds of Muslims rather than a mutual surrender to the absolute. The point of true Islam is surrender to the absolute. As I've explained, that's in a state of love and trembling, as Kierkegaard said, fear and trembling, because the power of the Creator is so vast and we are so small. But we can trust that the words of Muhammad, the revelation that came through the Quran, and all the other great sages and saints of Islam, give enough guidance to us to hone in to the place of unity, where our individual soul can blend with the absolute, so to speak, and we can follow the right path. And a true Muslim would study both the Sunni tradition and the Shia tradition, and see the wisdom in them both, and the Sufi tradition. And this is a lifetime's work. Each Muslim, I taught at the Muslim college with Islamic students who are profoundly intelligent people, graduates of different universities of Syria, of Afghanistan, of Iran, of Britain. And they're still, it's a lifetime study. One can never exhaust the spiritual riches of Islam. Even if one sat down now and tried to read all the books, one could never master it. There has to be a library, a madrasa in heaven, as far as I'm concerned, where true scholars can go and carry on. And I'm sure there is. But one thing I absolutely know is that they will always be teaching unity and peace. And I think countries can act as an agent of that process. And for all its mistakes and for all its errors, and the Iraq War, I think, was possibly the most major error in foreign policy that the UK has ever committed as a country. For all its errors, it nevertheless stands for the presence of the divine in the world, I think. I mean, the flag of the United Kingdom is the crosses conjoined of St Andrew, St George and St Patrick, and I think the Welsh dragon should be stuck in the middle, because the Welsh presence in the flag isn't there at the moment. But what it's saying by that flag is that we're an island of saints striving to bring light into the world, and that's a mission that we should continue with. And each faith of the people that live in this amazing island that we inhabit, these two islands, each faith that is here enriches our overall understanding and wisdom. It's primarily a Christian country, but there are people from every faith on the planet here now. And each of them brings an untold resource to the United Kingdom as a whole. And Islam and Sufism is one of the many that add to our spiritual richness and don't detract from it. I don't see that splitting up the United Kingdom and going down the route of a kind of nationalist regionalisation of the UK is going to advance the wisdom that we all need to help the planet as a whole come to its senses and and heal up the wounds of war. I now want to move on to another faith which is also present in the United Kingdom, and that's Zoroastrianism, a very ancient and noble religion from Persia. I've spent many years studying Zoroastrianism and have read the Gathas of Zoroaster and the commentaries, the Vendidad and the other scriptures which the Zoroastrians study and have preserved. I mean, it's an amazing ancient religion, going right back probably to about 1700 BC. Zoroaster was one of the earliest prophets living at the time of the Vedas in India, speaking a form of early Indo-Iranian. And these gathas, these hymns that have come down, are very early primal utterances. He was a priest. He was effectively a druid in the ancient Persian culture. And he lived at the same time as the druids were really putting the finishing touches to Stonehenge. It was already 1500 years old at the time Zoroaster appeared. So these islands of Britain were already peopled by advanced seers and sages equivalent to Zoroaster, the druid community. And Zoroaster was, should we say, our agent on the job in Persia. He was actually born in Balkh, in what is now in Afghanistan, but travelled widely. And his revelation, he's one of the first people known in history who received a direct revelation from the source, the creator, Ahura Mazda. And the revelation that came to him was that about the nature and function and purpose of human beings. Why are we here on this planet? The cosmological context is as follows. Even before this planet came into being, there was a conflict arose between the creator, Ahura Mazda, and, let's say, the anti-creator, the destructive force, who always seeks to undermine what the creator does. Now, the underminer force is known as Ahriman in Zoroastrian theology. And whenever somebody comes along and creates something beautiful, a child, a book, a city, a castle, Ahriman will always come along and try and corrupt and destroy it. And this happened when planet Earth was created. Ahura Mazda created a beautiful Earth, a paradise, and Ahriman said, no, I'm going to corrupt it, I'm going to destroy it. And this had been going on in all other parts of the universe. Now, the story, the teaching goes as follows, that Ahura Mazda then consulted with his chief archangels, the Amesha Shpentas, the great divine archangels, and he asked their advice, what should we do? And they said, well, why don't you create human beings? They will be like little ones of us. We'll put them on this planet, and we'll have this battle out. This is where we will stop and stand and fight Ahriman and defeat him. Because those little human beings, although they're little puny things, we will give them the spirit that can tell the difference between right and wrong. We will give them conscience. We will give them the ability to make right speech, right words, right thought and right deeds. And we will empower them ultimately to choose the right. And together we will then defeat Ahriman. And this will be the battle zone for the entire cosmos, because here on planet Earth, through human beings choosing righteousness and good thought and good mind and good deeds, we will defeat evil forever. Ahura Mazda thought about this and said, isn't that a bit hard on these little creatures, man, that we're thinking of creating? Gosh, that's a big responsibility. We need to give them some help, don't we? And so they all agreed with that. And the help that was agreed would be to send from time to time prophets or sages, people with a kind of supernatural intelligence that would strengthen and awaken the good conscience of mankind. Because people are lazy, people will fall asleep, people won't listen to truth, people start lying, they think it's easy and quick, people start doing spin and cheating and stealing and so on. So from time to time, Ahura Mazda said, no, I'm going to send a Seoshant, a prophet, a deliverer, a redeemer, who will issue a call of reminding to my dear children, human beings, men and women. And so this is what happened. And Zoroaster, therefore, came as a Seoshant, as a redeemer, and reminded us that our duty is to choose truth and righteousness, and not to fear, not to have fear, to speak out and to live for that truth and righteousness. So And Zoroaster said, after I've gone, others will come. And Zoroastrianism teaches that one day there will be what's called the Seishant, the next Redeemer. And this concept, the Seishant, actually became the concept of the Messiah in Christian teachings. And the whole idea of Christ emerged from that Zoroastrian concept of the Seishant. Now, not many people know this. This is advanced comparative religious studies, but I've studied this for many years and found this out. If you read Mary Boyce, the great expert on Zoroastrianism, if you talk to Zoroastrian priests, as I've done, and you go to the temples, there's one in Hampstead, very close to the Freud Museum, where Freud ended up living. Wonderful fire temple. They know the story behind Zoroastrian faith. And when I was working in London in advanced interfaith circles, I had many discussions with Zoroastrians and worked with them in Rome and at peace conferences and so on. So, and more recently I had a study day here at the Castle of the Muses on Iranian spirituality, and the leader of the World Zoroastrian Organisation came up and spoke from Oxford. So, the question is then, and the Zoroastrians are still, as it were, hoping and praying for the Seishant, who's going to come and help redeem the world, because this is a cosmic struggle between good and evil. Now, ironically, both Islam, Judaism and Christianity all got this idea of the Messiah figure from the Zoroastrians. My proposal is that if we open the Golden Gate, if we collectively choose to actualize that messianic principle collectively, we can choose peace as a community, as a globe, and stop having what I call these Messiah wars. My Muhammad is better than your Jesus. No, my Moses is better than your Muhammad, etc. Ridiculous Ouroboros chasing its tail. What we need to do is enlighten each other that actually the Messiah is within all of us collectively. And it's time for us to reawaken that Seishant principle. The question before us then is, what does Zoroastrian think about the Scottish independence referendum? So the Zoroastrian tradition, what light could it shed on this vital question of the referendum for Scottish independence and the creation of a new nation state? And I've explained something of the cosmology of Zoroastrianism. This is obviously just a very potted, brief version, but the point is that it's down to human beings to choose actively to participate with Ahura Mazda's project for mankind, which is to fundamentally purify and transcend the ignorance which causes suffering, conflict, violence, hatred, etc., which are anthropomorphized as Ahriman. Now, many philosophers and thinkers have written about the metaphysical meaning of Zoroastrianism. Nietzsche had a go, Rudolf Steiner wrote about it, a lot of esoterics have written about it. It's interesting that the word magic comes from the word Magi, which was the name for a Zoroastrian priest. Magic is actually, in a sense, the practice of Zoroastrian ethics. Now, what it means is that our choices are very important. One of the first things we can say about this is that Zoroastrianism affirms that how we choose is incredibly important. And in magic generally, there's this idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm. As we choose in the miniature sphere of our own life experience and our own capacity for choice, then we choose also in the macrocosm. And the magician works in the circle of their own consciousness and an immediate environment, and then by affecting either certain mental transformations or practical transformations. I mean, magicians can use also things representing the elements, earth, air, fire and water. They can use things representing other aspects of reality that they want to work with. And in so doing, then it's believed that that has an effect on the macrocosm. Now, it's a very interesting Scotsman, Sir James Fraser, who actually came from Helensburgh, near where I'm recording this, and then worked at Cambridge University, and I think was the greatest philosopher and mythologist in the 19th century, an anthropologist at the University of Cambridge, who, in his study of magic, this epic work, which he spent many, many years researching. He went into this aspect of magic, and this is one of the types of magic. I mean, he was a polymath and a great genius, and the fact that he was able to, as a Scotsman, freely inculcate his ideas at Cambridge, I think is yet another example of how the easy exchange between academics in Scotland and England has been of advantage to both countries over the years, enabled through the fact that we exist in a common country called the United Kingdom, and the same with Welsh and Irish academics. But the point I'm making here about Zoroastrianism is that it's very important, therefore, that we choose as wisely as we can within the compass of our own knowledge, and recognising that as we act, as we choose, then it has an implication for the wider sphere of existence. Now, this is the basis of Kantian ethics as well, the categorical imperative, as he describes it. As you act in the microcosm, you must do so in a way that you think can affect, if it affects the macrocosm, then it will be beneficial and to the advantage of all beings. That's the practice of, if you want, white magic. Now, in my understanding, as I've tried to explain, the breaking up of nation states, however worthy their subdivisions, and however wonderful it would be to have the world a patchwork of, let's say, 500 nation states, each with their own language. So you'd have the Bretons with their own nation state, the Basques, the Catalans, etc., etc., etc. Actually, it would be administrative and probably political and security chaos, because we'd be putting the clock back to a kind of tribalism, in effect, in which peace, security and well-being couldn't really be guaranteed. And therefore, to act in such a way that we advantage the idea of breaking up nations and creating that patchwork is actually, I think, from a Zoroastrian or a magical perspective, something that one wouldn't really want to be responsible for doing. It seems to me a diversion, and I'm only speaking personally as a philosopher. I have no political axe to grind here, in the sense of party politics. I'm simply speaking as a philosopher of religion and peace, that if we go down that route, we run the risk of creating contexts in which conflict and violence can rear their ugly head again. And as I've said, when philosophers and peace thinkers and so on, and we're looking at Yugoslavia, when I was studying at the University of London, Yugoslav history, one wouldn't have thought that it would soon break out into a maelstrom of conflict and violence. And I'm sure that people in the United Kingdom, no, fine, let's have several states here. But as I said, from a Druid perspective, with the gift of a long-term vision of events, it's taken us many hundreds of years to halt the border wars between the two peoples. And there's an element that in both societies that would love nothing more than to resume the kind of belligerent and bellicose, jostling and posturing that ultimately does lead to conflict. So from a Zoroastrian perspective, if we're going to choose wisely, I think one would wish to choose that which is most conducive to peace and harmony and to retaining unity, rather than disunity and disharmony, because then the forces of darkness, the forces of hatred and the forces of distinctiveness can creep in. Now, in the current setup in the UK, it seems to me we have the best of all possible worlds. We have recognition of the diverse nations that comprise the UK. We have parliaments in Wales and in Scotland and in England. We have in Northern Ireland, and we have a kind of UK-wide government as well as regional governments, and we have respect and tolerance for all cultures and races and creeds that live in the United Kingdom. And I think as a nation, we've done fairly well compared to, tragically, many other nations who are literally falling apart from internecine, interreligious wars and violence as we speak. The UK, from a Zoroastrian perspective, has actually been quite a good home to many Zoroastrian exiles, both from India, from the Parsi community in Bombay, and also from Iran. And I personally have been friends with some Iranian Zoroastrians and some who've come from the Parsi community in Bombay, and they're wonderful people, highly intelligent, and very conscientiously committed to the study of wisdom and truth. And the British in India, when we were governing in India, got on extremely well with the Parsis and found they were excellent administrators and had a very strong sense of ethics that chimed well with the British sense of fair play and sense of duty and so on. And in Bombay, the Zoroastrians were given refuge when they were forced out of Iran by the conquering Muslim armies. And the tolerance of India, the tolerance of Hindu culture, gave them a home. And then when the British were in India, obviously we continued with that policy, and there was a very strong camaraderie and bond of trust and mutual respect. In fact, the first Asian P in the British Parliament was a Zoroastrian, and his descendant, who's a friend of mine, has set up a spiritual retreat centre called the Asha Centre in the borders of the Welsh Marches in the Forest of Dean, and does excellent work with interfaith dialogue for peace, very similar to the work of the Institute here, and for long campaigned in the Liberal Democratic Party for creating a centre for immigration in the UK, actually, in London. And there was a property in Heathrow that nearly manifested that excellent idea, which was to affirm the multicultural nature of modern Britain and British society, and to look at all the waves and layers of immigration that have come in, right back to the early Celtic tribal peoples and the Anglo-Saxons, the Danes, the Vikings, the Normans, the Huguenots, the Jewish communities, the Italians, the Romans, and so on and so on, right up to the current day. Now, unfortunately, that proposal was blocked through I think hypocrisy among some politicians attached to the behind the scenes politicking. But the point is that there's an example of a modern day Zoroastrian in Britain trying to make a difference for our society, and there are others. The world's head of the World Zoroastrian Organisation came up to the cast and spoke at a special study day we had on Iranian spirituality not that long ago, an event that was filmed, and some fascinating discussions took place. So the point is, of course, that if we act as wisely as we can with the choices that are in front of us, we have to have a certain faith that we're helping advance, the work of redemption of Ahura Mazda. I think it's very important not to demonise the other. And in this debate about Scottish independence, there are good people on both sides. I mean, I've met people that will probably vote for independence who are wonderful people. I respect them greatly. And there are people who will be voting against Scottish independence who are also wonderful people. And I think we need to, in a sense, what we have is a contest of goods here. It's the good against the good, and I don't think we should demonise and see the alternative position as somehow working for Ahriman. But on the other hand, I think one has to be sensitive in one's own way to working out where that truth lies. Asha is the concept of justice in Zoroastrian language, and that's very important. But the importance of speaking out the truth is a duty on every Zoroastrian and every magician And what's interesting is the word druid is exactly cognate in Gaelic and Irish Celtic languages to the word Magi. So a druid by definition is in effect a kind of Zoroastrian, or to put it another way, it'd be safer to say that every Magi, every Zoroastrian, is a species of druid. And I'm speaking here just as Archdruid of the Peace Druids of Britain, that from a Zoroastrian perspective, it seems to me, from a Magi's perspective, after all, it was the Magi that came to celebrate the birth of baby Jesus, and the whole idea of the Seishan, the Messiah, which was celebrated in Christ, is the fulfillment of that promise given to Zoroaster, that, and in fact to creation, that Ahura Mazda would never leave the planet alone, that we're not on our own, us humans. We have help from transcendental supernatural sources, and Christ was one of those helpers, so was Zoroaster. I think that later philosophers of religion, like Suhrawardi, great Islamic Shia philosopher from Iran, of course would say, well, Muhammad was one of those Seishans, and I don't have a problem with that. I would concur. I would say that Guru Nanak was, that Mahavira was, that Buddha was, that Krishna was. And I would go so far as to say that, scholars also, in their own way, like Sir James Fraser, these great scholars of spirituality, like Mircea Eliade and so on, in a sense they're adding to that storehouse of light to try and transform the planet from a place of darkness, chaos, violence and ignorance. That surely is the work that we should be doing. And our nation-states are only valuable insofar as they act as a vehicle in which we can do that work. As a scholar, I'm quite... my commitment is to the Republic of Letters and to the Kingdom of God, or the Queendom of the Goddess, the place of wisdom and truth, which doesn't really exist on this plane. Nation-states come and go, and they're impermanent, and I recognise that, yes, just as the USSR might have been for some people a good nation, then it dissolved. It must have been a horrific experience for the people there. Yugoslavia must have seemed a permanent thing and a good thing, and then suddenly it's no longer there. The question, when we're facing the kind of the decision whether to kill off a nation state or not, is to say, well, actually, where is it in the ethical rankings? What is it doing? And the United Kingdom, as I said, does it provide security for its citizens? Does it provide freedom? Does it provide a good education for its children? Does it provide a good health service? Does it provide compassion and caring? Are there opportunities for a healthy, loving life? And I think that, by and large, although there are obviously problems with our society, it does. It's one of the world's, advantaged nations. And therefore, why on earth would we want to break it up into an unknown state of chaos, confusion, and legal wrangling from which only politicians, bureaucrats, and lawyers are going to benefit? So, I think a Zoroastrian perspective would say, well, keep together those things that seem to be acting as forces of light, and don't tamper with them unless you have 100% certainty that what you're going to put in its place is better. And this is why I think the invasion of Iraq, for instance, by US and UK forces was from a Zoroastrian perspective, a foolish thing. Because what happened was UK and US forces went in and destroyed a culture and a government and a state, and had nothing else to put in its place. Nothing was thought through. There was no peace policy. All there was a military policy. And once victory was achieved and George Bush struts around on his aircraft carrier and goes home, what he leaves behind is total chaos, maelstrom and destruction. This is the antithesis of an orthodox Zoroastrian ethical perspective. This is working for Ahriman. It's simply destructive. And it seems to me that I wouldn't want that to happen to my country, to the United Kingdom, which I love and have travelled throughout and lived here for many years. And as a Canadian, I also love and respect Britain as the mother country. I wouldn't like to see that to my country, or anything that could possibly remotely end up like that. So that's why I think, from a Zoroastrian perspective, one would be hesitant about destroying the United Kingdom. Now, from a Baha'i perspective, the Zoroastrian lineage of Saoshants predicted. I mean, the Baha'is believed that their founder, Abdul-Baha, who lived in Persia in the 19th century, was the next in that lineage chain of great seers, sages. And the Baha'is are wonderful people who campaign for peace throughout the world. They are non-violent people. They work through education. We used to have meetings when I was Secretary General of the World Conference on Religion and Peace in London in the 90s at the headquarters of the UK chapter of the Baha'is in Rutland Gate in London, near Westminster Synagogue, which is where Rabbi Albert Friedlander was rabbi, and he used to come to the meetings. And we often would discuss with the Baha'is, what can we most do to advance peace as interfaith leaders? How can we get dialogue between these religious leaders? And I was Secretary General of the chapter governing the whole of the United Kingdom and Ireland, and sat on a committee that met in Vienna and Paris and Rome, the Vatican, and the organisation has just recently had a big meeting in Vienna, and the Baha'is are still active in that, and other similar interfaith service organisations that are working for peace and harmony. They believe there will be one day a kind of world federation. They believe there should be a world government, a world federation. They're internationalists through and through. And I worked also on the committee of the World Federalists Association, which I joined in Canada in the 80s. And I believe ultimately that is the solution for the planet's nationalism. I think the problems we face as a planet are such that the only solution is international organisation, but done in a way that the nations can understand and work with. The European Union seems to be doing it in the wrong way by centralising and imposing petty regulation on people, rather than a marriage of hearts and minds, which leads to a kind of ethical calibration. Each culture in Europe is different. The Portuguese, the French, the Greek, the Italians, the way we do business, the way we do education, the way we do everything, courtship, marriage, relationships, building a house. Let the differences be celebrated, rather than trying to impose a kind of uniformity, but at the same time have, on issues that are of vital interest to us as Europeans, then common agreements, treaties, and a common European Union, but one that has a light touch. Now, I think the argument of internationalist movements like the Baha'is is that this will come one day. They have a Universal House of Justice in Haifa, in Israel, and they debate international issues. And I don't know, from a Baha'i perspective, I would have thought that keeping the United Kingdom together would make common sense, really. I'm not sure that creating lots of these separated nations is going to help advance that common cause for justice and peace that the Baha'is believe in, as do all the other great religions of mankind. I would have thought it just complicates everything and creates fission and ultimately can cause bad feeling. We've already seen how much bad feeling has been caused by people being slandered in the media and vituperative debates going on the internet, people like J.K. Rowling getting hate mail and so on. It's not acceptable. So the sooner we put it to bed, in my opinion, and get on with sharing these beautiful islands together and building a peace-loving country, the better. And I think that would be in harmony with what the Baha'is actually would like us to be doing, and any other kind of initiatory or revelatory lineage. And there are many. I'm having to truncate this talk, detailed in the periodic table of the world's religious and philosophical traditions, which I produced as a teacher of religions, as an academic specialist in religious studies like Mercy Alliard or someone. I've produced the periodic table of the world's religious and philosophical traditions to give an overview of just how incredibly complex they all are and how magnificent in their different categories. One of the varieties that I want to talk about is, and I want to just reflect on the question of referendum and the politics of the United Kingdom. Another one that's quite influential is Freemasonry. Now, this is often not talked about in public, and it happens to be something I've studied in some detail as a scholar. Now, Freemasonry is quite important in Scottish history, but also in English history and in Welsh and in British generally. And it's therefore of interest to reflect on this referendum from the perspective of Freemasonry. Now, the Grand Lodge of Scotland of Freemasons has effectively taken a neutral stand and has not stated one way or another whether it's for or against independence. Some Scottish Freemasons are for independence, like Michael Russell, the education minister, who's a Freemason, and some Scottish Freemasons are against independence. The lodges of Freemasons are not technically supposed to do politics or really to discuss religion. It's a different kind of take on ethics and spirituality. But Freemasonry has been very important in the history of Scotland since fairly early on, and also in England under the early period. The traditional history of Freemasonry in Britain was provided by Reverend Anderson, who did a wonderful Constitution and Charges, a kind of overview of the history of Freemasonry. And he takes it back to King Solomon and the early builders of Solomon's Temple, the Phoenicians and so on. And then through the Greeks, through the Dionysian artificers, through the Roman colleges of Masons, and then on to the medieval builders at Lake Como and elsewhere, who took the skills to build medieval cathedrals around different parts of Europe. And with them they took an initiatory tradition of passes and attitudes, really. A Freemason is someone who takes reality seriously and knows that there's more to a building than just getting the mortar and the tenons and the blocks built properly and the roof put in properly. Freemasonry was a kind of metaphysical building on of that notion that one has to build a building with moral integrity and get the tension right. And so the metaphor is a complex one. It was taken partly from Christ's teaching that we are the living stones that comprise the temple of wisdom. It was taken from Francis Bacon's idea, and I think Francis Bacon at the court of King James and previously Queen Elizabeth I had a great hand in formulating Freemasonry as a working lodge system. And I've been to Canterbury Tower in London where he rented space, and one theory is that the very first lodges of active Freemasons were going on there. So he grafted on a kind of metaphysical teaching around the operation of these different lodges, who were practicing Masons, yet who carried this energy of dignity and duty and responsibility in their work. And Freemasons have been very influential ever since. Now, in Scottish history, William Shaw, who was the Master Mason to King James, and who's buried at Dunfermline Abbey, was reputed to be a Master Mason also in the metaphysical sense. And his King James's wife, Anne of Denmark, was a great friend of William Shaw. William Shaw was actually a Roman Catholic, but in those days there wasn't this huge conflict which emerged later between Catholics and Freemasons. I think all they are different vocabularies or different languages that try and express the inexpressible, as Thomas Merton put it, raids on the unspeakable. And so the Freemason is someone who is sworn to uphold truth, to uphold justice, to uphold righteousness, and to seek for universal wisdom wherever it can be found in whichever religion. I mean, you can become a Freemason if you're a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Sikh or a Christian or a Jew or whatever, a Druid, a pagan. Many great pagans have been Freemasons, such as Gerald Gardner, who was one of the key figures in the transmission of modern Wicca. The list of Freemasons is absolutely fascinating, and it's something I've written and published about, and if people are interested they can read my detailed scholarly studies of this and how it's impacted in other religions. and on modern intellectual history, because the fact is that the modern Enlightenment associated with Britain, the whole Scottish, British, English Enlightenment that took off, was very inspired, I think, by the kind of intellectual freedom that they found within Freemasonry. Robbie Burns, the great bard of Scotland, was a Freemason. And so was Sir Walter Scott, the great novelist and poet and collector of oral legends about Scotland, and one of the greatest Scots, I think, of all time. So Freemasonry provided a meeting place for people outside of the narrow confines of their own intellectual or religious heritage. You might go to the lodge and meet people who were Methodist Christians or Presbyterian or Anglican or Church of Scotland or Jewish or Sikh or Hindu. In India, the Freemasons were very, very important for providing a kind of cement that bound the society together, and many great Indian figures became or joined Freemasonry. And for instance, the father of Pandit Nehru, who became the first Prime Minister of an independent India, was the Grand Master of the Bengali Freemasons. And many figures in intellectual history in India have been inspired or influenced by Freemasonry over the centuries. Also in Theosophy, which is an important esoteric movement founded by Helena Blavatsky, the great Russian mystic, she herself became a Freemason and inspired the creation with Annie Besant and others of lodges that included women as well as men on equal terms, which was obviously part of the advancement of women's rights in the 19th century in general. And a whole series of amazing women mystics developed, like Annie Besant and Blavatsky, and also Alice Bailey, who was married to Foster Bailey, a Freemason, and who carried on that theosophical vein into the 1920s and transmitted a whole series of amazing texts, which I've spoken about at a historical conference on the history of Theosophy in London at the Theosophical Headquarters, and back in the 80s. So Freemasonry is a kind of commitment, therefore, to a universal, eclectic, visionary wisdom which transcends the outer forms and structures of religions. One respects each religion, be you a Hindu, a Muslim, a Sikh, or whatever, but what you're interested in is the inner connectivity, the inner spiritual form within the building. I mean, what's the point of having great churches and temples and cathedrals if the spirit of the people that are operating there is wrong? You obviously have to bring up people into a sense of ethics, of responsibility and duty and love and compassion and caring for there to be any point in having the building. Otherwise, as Christ said, you're just dressing the windows and not attending to the inner man and woman. So technically, Freemasons aren't really supposed to interfere in the dynastic politics of countries or to engineer changes in constitutions. I mean, I think they're supposed to be neutral when it comes to street fighting and party politics and so on. So personally, I'm not I mean, Freemasonry has always been tolerated in Britain since the reign of Queen Elizabeth I and King James, and even further back in time. I mean, there's reports of lodges meeting under King Athelstan in York in the 10th century, and there's ancient charges dating back to that time. I think any monarch worth their salt will respect learned people, and Freemasons and Masons are learned people. They can build buildings, castles, cathedrals, but the Freemasons among them have a knowledge of the wisdom that you need to people the buildings. So a figure like Sir Christopher Wren, one of the great architects of British history, and a polymath and a genius from Wiltshire, was also an operative Freemason as well as a practicing architect. And so too was Sir Isaac Newton, another great polymath and genius from the same epoch. They were both members of the Royal Society. Many of the scientists involved with the Royal Society were Freemasons, as was Desaguliers, who helped take these ideas into the European stage. And if you read Margaret Jacobs' wonderful work, The Early Enlightenment, about this epoch and this time. These Freemasonry acted as a kind of leaven for free thinking throughout Europe, and it was taken then to America and acted as a leaven for Enlightenment ideas throughout Europe, and still has, I think, notwithstanding it has a very negative record in, let's say, the mass media, the public eye, the kind of the sort of media that likes to whip up storms of hatred and so on. Now this goes back to forces that really oppose science and oppose the Enlightenment. And in a very brief nutshell, the kind of extreme reactionary religious views opposed Freemasonry because they really didn't want science to be given credence when it comes to who runs a state. They wanted theocrats to run the state. Christopher Wren, in a sense, acted as an example of a Freemason who stood opposed to that intolerance, and the Royal Society and the earlier work of Sir Francis Bacon, which was really the intellectual roots of the Royal Society, have been amply explored in his Invention So Fertile, A Life of Christopher Wren by Adrian Tinniswood. And the inventions that Freemasons have made, the contributions they made to science, Lavoisier, Priestley, enormous numbers of scientists and inventors and engineers and so on have been also Freemasons. And the fact that in the United Kingdom they were able and allowed to flourish, I think is a sign of credit to this country. Now, if you look at the forces that have attacked Freemasonry in history, and you go into it seriously, then you'll discover that Adolf Hitler hated Freemasons. He has, in his Mein Kampf and other writings, he has a huge, unbelievable rambling tirades and attacks against Freemasons because he equated them with the Jews and with the dark conspiracy trying to take over the world. And he saw himself as destroying that, and ultimately this led to the Holocaust and to World War II. When Poland was invaded by the Nazis, there were many Freemasons in Poland. They all ended up in Auschwitz. They were killed. When Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, Thomas Masaryk, the first president of a free Czechoslovakia, had been a Freemason. And the Freemasons of Czechoslovakia were rounded up and killed. The same in Paris, when the SS attacked the headquarters of the Grand Orient, the Freemasonic lodges of Paris. They stole all the papers and they rounded up and killed off as many Freemasons as they could. It was very interesting. I spoke to the local Church of Scotland minister at Loch Goyle, who described there was a Church of Scotland minister in Paris who did his best to smuggle out people from France who were fleeing from the Nazis. Many Jews, Freemasons and so on escaped. Winston Churchill was a Freemason, so was Roosevelt. Now, these people stood for a kind of enlightened, tolerant discourse in society, which totalitarian regimes don't like. They don't like people to have, that kind of independence. So the Nazi Party outlawed Freemasonry and clamped down on it and tried to kill, literally, Freemasons wherever they could be found. And they had this kind of bogeyman witch hunt attitude. So did Franco in fascist Spain. He actually wrote a couple of tracts against Freemasonry. And he said the Republican government had been riddled with Freemasons. And his fascist coup was in a sense an anti-Masonic coup. And it led to the slaughters and the horrors of the Spanish Civil War. The most horrific among them all being the bombing of Guernica, courtesy of Adolf Hitler's Air Force, but with the request of Franco, and the destruction of the Basque town of Guernica was really a kind of assault on that idea that people can live in harmony and different cultures can coexist in peace, which is the hallmark really of what I think Freemasonry leads to. As if it has a political edge, it's really about enlightenment. The individual in their context, is encouraged to develop their skills, their knowledge, their education, their wisdom, their learning, to act wisely and justly and so on. And then that acts as a leaven for the whole of society, so then that leads to a more enlightened and tolerant society. But forces that don't want that, of course, will oppose it. Now, in Iran, under Khomeini, there was a clamping down on Freemasonry, and again it was declared persona non grata, and Freemasons were persecuted. The same, sadly, under Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. Again, a dictator decided that Freemasons deserved rounding up and squashing. And the same in Mussolini's Italy. Again, Freemasons were regarded as dangerous and wicked and therefore to be killed. All of which, begs the question of, well, the United Kingdom has always tolerated Freemasonry and has been a haven for free thinking, a haven for liberal thought, a haven for progressive thought. Yet at the same time, a place where duty and morality and ethics are taken seriously in our education systems, in our institutions, and in our governance structures. We do have a democracy, but we also have a constitutional monarchy. We found it best to keep these things running in parallel, because you don't want tyranny, but you also don't want kind of mob rule and the gusts of wind and infatuation that blow through the like Mexican waves through democratic masses, can fall prey to delusion, as we saw in Nazi Germany when the mass electorate voted in Hitler. And I think particularly when you get into nationalism, you run the risk of creating these kind of gusts of enthusiasm that can lead ultimately to a climate of intolerance. And so my own feeling is that Freemasons throughout Scotland and the United Kingdom will be looking at this referendum with some trepidation, and really those that haven't already, as it were, become out and out Scottish nationalists. And it seems to me it's almost like a religious faith, Scottish nationalism, and it seems to be, with all due respect, a kind of pseudo-religious faith, premised on anti-Englishness, anti-UKness, and a kind of moral salvationism that by becoming suddenly independent, Scotland is going to be, the kingdom of God on earth, as if Scottish people are somehow going to be more noble, more righteous, more upright, more peace-loving than any other nation on the planet. I don't see the evidence for that, with all due respect. What I do see is a lot of demonisation being whipped up against anyone who isn't, judged to be Scottish enough, and a lot of very sad attacks on the culture and country that I thought we shared, which was built largely, partly by Freemasons. So, just to give another example, the Queen Victoria, who was a great lover of Scotland and who came to Scotland many times, lived at Balmoral, and was very proud to be Queen of Scotland as well as Queen of England and Wales, as well as Empress of India and so on. Her father, the Duke of Kent, was himself a very senior Freemason, and he was at one point the head of the Freemasons of Canada, and that's why Victoria always greatly respected the work of the lodges and so on, and by and large royal families throughout Europe, in Scandinavia, in Britain, and in many other cultures have been sympathetic to the work of the lodges, because they recognise that they are an ornament to the well-being of the nation. So I'm unable to, obviously I'm not myself a member of any particular Freemasonic lodge. I'm merely a historian and philosopher who studied Freemasonry with sympathetic detachment, but also objectively. And I'm not saying that all Freemasons are good, or that just because you're a Freemason you're necessarily a good person. There have been probably some bad ones too. And we saw the horrific attack in Oslo by this crazy man shooting people on an island. I believe he'd infiltrated the Freemasonic Lodge of Oslo, and you get wicked people also pretending to be things that they're not. But I would have thought that Freemasons throughout Britain would be looking at this referendum with some concern and some wish. There must be a sentimental attachment to the United Kingdom, I would have thought, among their ranks. And I would be surprised that too many of them will feel that Scottish nationalism is such an important quasi-religious cause that it deserves so much oxygen that we allow it to break up the whole United Kingdom, which is quite a precious jewel among nations and internations, because the United Kingdom really is itself a cluster of nations. It's an experiment in intranational fraternity. And fraternity is the key thing that Freemasonry believes in. And the fact that Robbie Burns was a Freemason, but he was also sympathetic to the United Kingdom. And during the onset of the Napoleonic Wars, he was extremely, he wrote poetry in praise of the United Kingdom's stand against military nationalism. The French Republic, in a sense, went too far in its rejection of the religious symbols which had governed medieval Europe and early modern Europe, which were kept in Britain, like the monarchy and so on, and ended up, in a sense, trying to hurry its way into this new kingdom of republicanism and so on through violence. And I think Robbie Burns was wise enough to see through that and knew that you can't force people to be free. It has to arise from their hearts in fraternity. Another tradition I want to talk about, and I've mentioned a little bit, is the pagan tradition of the runic culture, sometimes known as a satru. It's a Norse kind of religious tradition, and it is found scattered throughout the Norse and Nordic peoples of Scandinavia. The Viking peoples practiced rune divination and rune magic, but so did the Anglo-Saxons. Professor Tolkien of Oxford University was an expert on the runes, and the runes are fascinating, discovered or identified as such by Odin, the deity who may also, according to Thomas Carlyle, the great Scottish philosopher, in his book on heroes and heroes worship, Odin might have been also a human, a person that was later divinized as a god. And I think the wisdom of the runes are profound, and it's really deep-rooted in the Anglo-Saxon, the Norse, the Germanic, the Viking soul. And from a runic perspective, Odin brings the gift of seership to the rune masters, and therefore the ability to see very long-term perspectives. There is struggle and strife in life, and one interpretation of the Völuspá saga is that there will be a thing called Ragnarok, a kind of a violent confrontation between different forces, different groups of deities. And for those of you that have seen the wonderful film Thor, it gives a kind of flavour of what this cosmology is about in a populist guise. The runes, I believe, trace back to an even earlier substratum of mystical wisdom, and in my own work as a scholar of language and comparative spirituality, I've written a book called The Kabbalah Runes. I think that the runic mysteries trace back to a common source through the Indo-European language family and tribal cultures, back to a common source with the Hamito-Semitic tribal cultures, who were the Jewish and ancient Egyptian, Arabic, Babylonian, Phoenician peoples. And I think that this myth that we're all separate people and that we all speak separate languages is not really true. I think we all ultimately descend from common ancestry, and science bears this out in the study of population, descent and genetics and so on. And I think it's inevitable, therefore, that our understanding of sound and language and letters goes back to a common root from the Indo-European runic tradition and the Hamito-Semitic Kabbalistic tradition, which basically says the same thing. What they say is that reality is made up of these certain energy forces or elemental forces, which are mirrored in the alphabet, in the sounds that we all use, in order to then make language, to make intelligent speech, to have discourse, to have minds that can travel one to another. And I gave I've written this book, and I gave a conference in Edinburgh about this, a seminar about the Kabbalah runes, not that long ago. The implication of my thesis, and I think it can be documented scientifically, I mean, it's ahead of its time, it's the science of comparative Semitic languages is quite new. We don't really have as much work done in comparative Hamito-Semitic languages. Nobody's really mapped the soundscapes of Hebrew speech and Arabic and Phoenician and Babylonian and ancient Egyptian and Aramaic, the language of Jesus, and Syriac and Ethiopian languages, which is from the same tree, and the languages of all of Arabia, all the different dialects and tribes, including Yemen and the south and so on. When we get all that mapped more effectively, and then you can run that against the soundscapes of Indo-European word roots, I think what we're going to find, and what I've done is just like a kind of scout gone into this, I think you're going to find there's congruity here. Now, the point about a rune master is or a Kabbalist, as I'm effectively saying they go back to the same root, is that they can see the interconnections between things. The tree of life, the Sephiroth, 10 wonderful Sephiroth, they are the very shape and structure of the divine being itself. They're a map, a clue to us mortals as to our own actual nature. Because each of us is made in the image of God. We have all those 10 Sephiroth within us. And we can tune into them and harmonise with them by using the sounds of Hebrew, but also by using the runes of the Norse languages. And in my book I've provided practical tools how to combine these methods. But what I think you do as a Kabbalist or a rune master is you tune into the interconnectedness between things. It's the links between the Sephiroth, the journeys that we make, that makes, as it were, the God nature possible. It's the wholeness that flows between these different Sephiroth, or stations of being. And I would say this is a metaphor also for countries. Some people talk about a ley line, or a series of ley line energy lines crossing as a grid the whole of the British Isles and Europe and the globe. I think that's a beautiful metaphor, and I think, in a sense, if you think of the whole of the United Kingdom as a kind of tree of life, you will get different energy centres, like at Glastonbury and Primrose Hill in London, and the different sacred centres as you come up, the spine of Britain, the Pennines and so on, up to right up through the Scottish, mountains and so on, right up to the top. When I was travelling up past Ben Nevis once, it was a beautiful sunny afternoon, and you could see Ben Nevis, the largest, highest mountain in Britain, with the sun crowning her, the setting sun. And it was an extraordinary imagery, and I realised this was the crown chakra of the whole of Britain, effectively, this incredible mountain landscape, and then driving back across the moors. From the Kabbalistic or runic perspective, then, you can't work the runic alphabet with only just a few of the runes. You need the whole lot working together. You need them to be in communication with each other. And the same with every sound that we utter. You can't speak unless you can use all the sounds and vowels of your language system. If somebody by decree said, well, from now on you have to speak, but you can't use F, D, R or N because they're in the name Daffern, and that's anathema, he thinks too much, so we're going to abolish D, F, R and N. Well, I think it would soon the possibility of speaking would evaporate, and people would be reduced to making kind of grunt noises. What we need as Kabbalists and searchers for the absolute, metaphysical voyagers, whatever you want to call rune masters, and people that are interested in the mysteries, Druids, the Sufis, each language has a different word for them, right? Philosophers is one of the best words, going back to ancient Greece. But whatever you call us, we do need to have full access to all the soundscape to be able to be understood and to be able to communicate and to be able to do our work, which is to point out, to warn, to teach, to cajole, and to woo, and to educate. Educare means to lead people on, ultimately, into the light. The job of the educator is to educare people, but they can only do that with access to the full complexity of all the soundscape that each language, culture, and people make available. And so, to me, now talking more about the matter of nationalism and politics and so on, politics is really not very helpful in this project. As you can see, I'm a believer in philosophy and not politics. Politicians have to get out of the way of rune masters and genuine philosophers. What politicians seem to like doing is blocking and saying no to stuff. They seem to like creating committees of disablement. And I'm not at all surprised that in political power the industry of disablement has become so vast. We pour vast resources into disability support, but nothing into ability support very much. Because in a sense politics depends on people remaining ignorant, because then we can look to these leaders in their parliaments to prance around and tell us what's right and wrong. The irony is that the more we find out about politicians, the more we discover their own grasp on ethics is rather primitive, and yet they're the ones making all the so-called laws for us. By giving more power to these politicians, by creating a whole new nation state where they can strut around with complete freedom to do whatever they want within that sphere. My fear is that it's like restricting the capacity for discourse within the ken of not just philosophers and scientists, but also ordinary people. I think that to be a member of the United Kingdom, to be an active citizen in service to the United Kingdom, is actually a great honour and a privilege. We're very fortunate to live in this country, with all its rich texture, from the East and West Midlands to the Welsh Hills, to people of Cornwall and Devon, to Wessex, to Wiltshire, and the people of London, incredible metropolis, one of the greatest cities on the planet, and the people of Kent, and the people of Scotland and Northern Ireland, with all their complexities, and the lowland Scots and people of Edinburgh and Glasgow, and they're all very proud of their differences. And every region is unique and immaculately beautiful, in my experience. I fell in love with the Isle of Arran as a boy. I still think it's the most beautiful place on the planet. Now I've fallen in love with Argyll. I think it's the most extraordinary place. Doesn't mean I don't love the whole of the rest of the country. Of course I do. And as a rune master and a Kabbalist, my job is to see the beauty of that complexity maintained. What I don't want is people coming along, measuring up, sticking up fences and borders and saying, well, we're carving out new nations here. Because, for why? What's the point? So, from a runic perspective then, I would say let the conversation continue. Now, there are some people that say, no, we want a separate Scotland because it'll be like Norway, it'll be a peace-loving nation, it'll be disarmed, it'll have lots of oil wealth, and will become a very civilised voice in the world. And look, come on, there were lots of Vikings in Scotland, so really this is just the Vikings taking over and, it's creating a little Norway in Scotland. And why doesn't Scotland join the Nordic Union after all? That's a confraternity of peace-loving Nordic countries, and Scotland could apply for membership. Well, okay, it's a nice idea, all that. I love Norway. I've been there many times. I know Denmark and Sweden as well, and I've not been to Iceland yet. I'd love to go. And Finland, again, I haven't been. All these Scandinavian countries are amazing, and yes, Scotland deserves to be ranked among them. But so, I would argue, does the whole United Kingdom. There are people of Danish and Viking descent scattered throughout the British Isles. Dublin was founded by Vikings. So was Waterford. Many Irish people are of Viking descent. I should come clean. I'm part Viking descent myself. Through my surname, Daffern, de la Fern, which means I'm probably a direct descendant of Odin. And in my blood are probably rune masters going back to the dawn of time. People of Yorkshire, where my mother came from, the Clough family, are largely of Viking descent. The word Clough, which is my middle name, is a Viking word. So, what I'm saying, I would actually like, and I have had a campaign going for some time, the whole United Kingdom to join the Nordic Union. I don't want just Scotland to have that pleasure. I think the United Kingdom as a whole, there's no reason why we can't join the Nordic Union. It's a wonderful club. We get certain benefits that come with it. And one of them is we can talk seriously about, our commitments to peace. Why don't we have things like the Nobel Peace Institute in London? Why don't we have research into resolving conflict like at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute? My mission, my task, was to create a chair and an Institute of Peace Studies and Peace Research at the University of London. Well, I still think, yes, let's join the Nordic Union. We're more likely to get very advanced peace thinkers to come over and teach in Britain than if we're seen as this kind of dragon state that goes around invading countries like Iraq. I'd love the UK as a whole to join the Nordic Union. And Scotland, by all means, can lead that admissions process. But I would say we don't have to break up the United Kingdom to do that, to assert the Nordic nature of our identity. On the contrary, we should affirm the whole United Kingdom as a member wishing to join the Nordic Union, for the advantages and the the cultural benefits that brings. And from my perspective, the most important being the peace dividend that it would bring. So, from a runic perspective, then let's do more research on these runes. They're absolutely fascinating. Why isn't runes taught in every religious studies department in the country? Why aren't Anglo-Saxon studies advanced more in schools? Why aren't there is a wonderful centre for runic studies at the University of Aberdeen, and professional runologists work in Scotland and elsewhere in different parts of academia. In the University College as well, there's been some good work done on the runes. All this is documented and referenced in my book on the Kabbalah runes. And what I'm saying is, let's keep the United Kingdom together. Let's get on with finding not just the incredible interestingness of the runes and rune magic, and that's what, after all, Tolkien based The Lord of the Rings on, and to some extent Harry Potter was based on, J.K. Rowling's epic, masterpiece. But let's go even further and look at how these runes and these runic traditions, how the Odin traditions and the traditions of the seers were actually married to much older sources of ancient Egyptian and Hamito-Semitic and Jewish, Hebrew and Arabic and so on. What I'm calling for is an assembly of the sages of all the peoples of the planet. And that's what my Dictionary of Philosophical Terminology is about. That's what the Kabbalah runes is about. That's what the Castle of the Muses is about. I believe there is an underlying bedrock unity between all the peoples, tribes and races of the planet. and that ultimately would descend from that wisdom lineage which is universal and common to us all. My view of nation states that come and go like grass, as Isaiah said, is, do they serve that wisdom? Do they help advance people in that light? Do they bring people up to be mature, responsible, peace-loving, highly educated, highly articulate people? And if so, then they're worth keeping. My experience, I can only speak as one little voice. I'm been very privileged to grow up in the United Kingdom. I went to school in Brighton, went to university in Bristol, went to university in London. I've taught at the University of Oxford and at London, and have travelled widely throughout the whole United Kingdom. I've then taught in many schools throughout the UK and now in Scotland and in Wales. And I think it's an unbelievably rich country for cultural resources, intellectual resources, history of science. I've been to Woolsthorpe Manor, where Newton cracked the secrets of gravity, or some of them. We have still many to crack. I've been around Burghley House, where Lord Burghley lived, who was the Prime Minister of Queen Elizabeth. I've been around, many parts of the United Kingdom, and we have such an incredible, rich diversity of intellectual and spiritual resources to draw on. Why on earth would anybody want to smash that up? It seems to me a kind of moral vandalism. And what for? In the name of a particularity, one particular lineage of identity. It seems bizarre to me. It's as if a bunch of beautiful runes would suddenly split up, and a little cluster of them would go off and say, well, we're not going to talk to you, we're a different alphabet. I'm sorry, the rune master, the Kabbalist, can't work like that. It's the wholeness of things that is of interest. So I want to move on and look at this from a specifically Kabbalistic perspective. So it seems to me, by the way, just to finish here, that anyone interested in the runes, anyone interested in the Satru, anyone interested in the Nordic mysteries, seriously and deeply, would have to think very carefully about wanting to break up the United Kingdom. We're a country that allows wisdom to be studied in detail. We have that freedom. We have incredible intellectual freedom here. Let's not throw it away and allow a petty nationalism to kind of, create possible conditions which long term might jeopardise that. And I think that the Scottish intelligentsia, people like Fraser and people like the great heroes of the Enlightenment, were of such a profound intelligence, and include Hume and people like it in that, and Thomas Carlyle. I can't believe the Scottish mind would want to, and in a sense, divorce itself from its own creation. It was the Scottish mind that helped give birth to the Enlightenment, that made modern scholarship possible. It was the poet James Thomson who founded University College with Jeremy Bentham, and the Savills of London, many of whom were Scottish, who created these instruments of higher education for the advancement of people in this country and indeed globally. Why would the people who've given birth to the Enlightenment then want to kind of cut off and say, well, sorry about this Enlightenment, we're going to retire now, and we're going to kind of retire to our own little nation group, and we're going to shut the doors and pretend, and you can all go away with all your problems and all the terrible things that, say, imperialism has created. And, well, no, sorry, it was the Scottish genius that helped give birth to the British Empire, which has now become the British Commonwealth. And as Richard Tarnas in his book The Passion of the Western Mind says, and other great intellectual historians, such as Global Intellectual History by Samuel Moyne and Andrew Sartori, based on some new work at the University of Columbia in New York, into really realising how global the circulation of ideas are, how philosophies are not restricted to neat, tidy little things called nation states. The great thinkers of the planet have always been pushing out the boundaries. As I said, Abelard, the founder of the University of Paris, one of the great Celtic thinkers of medieval France, from Brittany, was in touch with people in Cordoba in Spain, Jewish and Muslim. He was interested in universal wisdom, universal knowledge. Why do you think Plato and Pythagoras were always travelling? They wanted to meet people. Pythagoras was part Phoenician, not just pure blood Greek. He was Phoenician. He was a mixed race person. And it's the people on the cusp of identity that are often the most creative. Look at Christ himself. He was probably, well, he was certainly from a rich and interesting intellectual heritage. From Galilee, which was subject to lots of different currents and swirling ancient traditions, and also the Sea of Galilee was sacred to the goddess in ancient times, to Atargatis, the Syrian goddess of water and fertility and the fish. And he was visiting Phoenicia as well, had Phoenician students who helped invent the alphabet. Well, they discovered the first alphabet, and were geniuses in their own right. And he also spent time in Egypt. We know that Christ was taken there by Joseph and Mary as a baby to escape Herod's wrath, and therefore the implication is they would have taken him back. They had family there, they had friends and relatives, and that's probably where Christ received his part of his higher education, so to speak. And the Egyptian mind was profoundly similar to Christ's own understanding that the spirit behind the teaching is what's important. The parable has a meaning which has to be extracted from the mere narrative story. The whole biblical narrative is a kind of parable that from which we have to extract the meaning kernel. That was the point of Christ, and that was the point of Philo, who was another great Jewish savant alive at the same time. And that was the point of Plato's method. You look in the myth for the meaning, but you don't get stuck with the literal meaning. And it seems to me that to be truthful and to affirm that complexity of cultural dynamics that underlies these great teachers and their work, I think the United Kingdom has done a pretty good job at producing people of that stature. We have a philosophical heritage we should be proud of in this country, and it's precisely because we've had elements from Welsh, from Celtic, from Irish, from Scottish, from Pictish, from Viking, from Norman, and now from Jewish and Islamic and Sikh and Hindu and Jain and Buddhist and so on, and that we have this tremendous capacity to. English has become a vehicle where we can integrate and synthesize the insights and wisdoms of people, as it were, throughout the planet. It's a tremendous responsibility, but it's something we can do with love, I think. And figures like William Blake and the great romantic visionaries like Shelley and Keats, they realise you can only do this through art, finally and ultimately. Poetry and art and philosophy, in a sense, go together, and that's why in Scotland they celebrate the bards and the poets still in a living tradition, as we do in Sussex and Wales and elsewhere. So I think it's good news. I think really what I'm trying to say in these contributions to this debate is, let's respect each other's views. And I think myself that, having gone into this, that if you were interested in the runes and the wisdom of the Nordic peoples, you'd want to probably affirm the United Kingdom, because it's been a place where those peoples have been able to flourish and to practice their paths. Now in the Pagan Federation and other conglomerations of Asatru followers, there is a freedom of religious practice, which is rare and precious and wonderful. But I don't think it should be, disflavoured with the need to break up what is a beautiful country as a whole. And I do think that these studies should be more common. And in my own teaching as a religious studies teacher, in my schoolwork, I've often had children in the younger years, year 7, make a set of runes from pebbles collected on the beach, and then you illustrate them with the runic symbols, and it becomes a divinatory tool, a tool of knowledge. I think that's what schools are for, what education is for, and I think Odin, in a sense, a metaphor, archetype of wisdom, would probably want to say, well, let's keep this country together, but let it become a truly wise country. Let it flourish. Let it join as a whole, say, the Nordic Union. Let it have its peace institutes, and let it pay as much attention to peace policy as it used to military policy. That would be my dream, and I think all rune masters and seekers of wisdom within that tradition surely would concur. So next I just want to comment on this question of Scottish independence from the perspective of the Jewish community and from the perspective of the Kabbalah itself. Jews have lived in Britain for many, many centuries, and it's probable that in the times of the early Roman Empire, for instance, some Jews found their way here. There's also been a congruence or a parallelism between the ancient Druid path and the ancient Jewish faith, and there are similarities between the Druid teachings of cosmology and the Hebrew Kabbalistic teachings, and I've enumerated this and gone into it in my lectures on Druidry and transpersonal history, and my talks on Druidry, but also on the Kabbalah Runes book, which I published recently. I've known many rabbis in my day and used to teach in London. I taught at the Muslim College, but I also had strong connections with Rabbi Friedlander at Westminster Synagogue. And Rabbi Friedlander was the Dean of Studies at Leo Baeck College, which was founded by a great rabbi who was the head of the German Jewish community, and then was in Theresienstadt concentration camp, where he managed to stay alive by running workshops on philosophy. And he managed to find other inmates who were interested, and they used to discuss Plato and philosophy from memory. They weren't really allowed books. And that was their antidote to the ignorance and the barbarism that was all around them, was to continue to study wisdom and to believe in philosophy, notwithstanding the horrors and the stupidity of what was happening to them. In Montreal, where I was born, there was a strong and important Jewish community, which included many intellectuals and many Savills, and one of the most important for me and the biggest influence on me, although I never met him personally, was Rabbi Klein, who edited the Etymological Dictionary of English, which I discovered when I was in Canada in the 70s. And this was a polymath, a philologist, who spent his whole life, as well as being a rabbi and leading a congregation, he was interested in the origin and derivation of words, and he took it as an intellectual debt to research, although of course Hebrew was his main language of religious piety. Because English is the main language that he spoke, he wanted to repay the debt by researching in enormous detail into the etymology of English. And so he'd take a word like idea or imagination or faith and break it right down into its early modern forms, its medieval, its Anglo-Saxon roots, and then go even further back into its Indo-European roots, if it had come from, say, a Germanic cluster or from a Latin root or a Greek root, and then taking it right back to its Indo-European roots. And when I found this book, I was absolutely in awe of it, and it became my most favoured possession when I studied in Calgary in the late 70s. And it inspired me to really begin my thinking about the Kabbalah and what I believe that the Kabbalah stands for. And later, at the same time, I was learning a bit of Hebrew and studying the scriptures through the lens of the Kabbalah and through the analysis of the sounds and the meaning soundscapes of the Hebrew language. I think later, when I lived in London in the early 80s and studied with many great Kabbalists and worked with a few in person, and then researched in the history of the Kabbalah and went back to look at Isaac Luria and the works of Gershom Scholem, who's traced the history of all this, and then ended up going to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which has Scholem's library. I think the Jewish mind has given an immense gift to mankind, and I think the polemics and rhetoric of anti-Semitism and the anti-Jewishness that's going on in the world is a horrendous mistake, and the attacks on Israel and on Jewishness by the Nazis and by other anti-Semitic political movements, I think, are tragic. But sometimes the Jewish people are their own worst enemy, and this, I think, is true of all of us. Ultimately, all of us suffer from doubt and self-doubt and self-hatred, and it's when Christ was asked what's the most important commandment, he said, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind and soul. In other words, be a multi-dimensional figure. Be like Lu, the great Druid god. Be a Samuel Danach, and exercise your compassion, your altruism, your love in all spheres, all directions, all levels, all quadrants, as Ken Wilber says. That's your first duty, to love the source through everything you do and touch. But the second is to love your neighbour as yourself. And that means that you have to also love yourself. Because if you love your neighbour as yourself, you have to love them both, yourself and your neighbour. Because ultimately you are your neighbour. We are each other. We make each other. We create each other through intercycling lifetimes of reincarnational magic. And so the Scots and the English and the Welsh and the Irish, we are each other. We are constantly recycling through each other. And that's as it should be. And the same with all the other tribes of the planet. The Hebrews, the Arabs, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, and so on. Is there a commonality? Is there a point of common reference? Well, I think this was the genius of Abraham. I think what Abraham saw was that there is a unity that underpins the whole thing. And this is what he called, in a sense, God. This is what it means to affirm monotheism. It's not what I call vulgar monotheism, that there's a one God who rules it over everything and beats up everyone that protests. That's what's leading to the slaughter of Gaza and Palestine as we speak. That's exoteric monotheism. Esoteric monotheism is with Spinoza, and I think with Abraham himself, and all the great Kabbalists and the true rabbis, and certainly with the rabbis I've known, Friedlander and Hugo Grin and people, that it's the inner unity implicit within the diversity that can be found by the sage or scholar or Kabbalist to be hiding under the diversity, which can be revealed, tenderly and lovingly in the text or in the teaching, and that then manifests as that unity, as that hidden goddess, the Shekinah, the Sophia, the principle that in the Solomonic wisdom scriptures is hovering with God at the beginning of creation. That's what true Judaism is about, and it's about finding that in everything and everyone. And we're blessed, I think, in this country to have had some wonderful Jewish scholars, rabbis, saints, scientists. My own PhD supervisor, Dr. Herb Blumberg of Goldsmiths College, was one of the world's leading experts on the psychology of conflict resolution, a great New York American Jewish thinker and psychologist. And, thank God for these people. They are making intellectual life in Britain so much richer. And in a sense, the Nazis' loss was our gain. When the Nazis kicked them out of Germany, a lot of them came to London and Britain. And I was fortunate when I was working at the University of London creating the Peace Studies Institute to meet people like Hans Hochster, a great psychotherapist and counsellor who had managed to get out of the clutches of the Nazis. And all his life, therefore, after, he spent trying to exercise compassion to help people who who'd suffered traumas and so on. So there's been a kind of love relationship, I think, between the British and the Jewish people, and this goes back also to the time of Cromwell, when the Jews were readmitted to Britain, and added to the fecund, richness of ideas in the early Enlightenment time. It was a rabbi from Amsterdam who was involved with Cromwell and the readmission of the Jews to Britain. I think the Jews have also been active in Spain in its heyday, in Cordoba, in the golden age of Andalusia, and at the time of Moses de Leon and the founding of the Zohar, and this transmission of Kabbalistic wisdom. The fundamental wisdom underlying Judaism, therefore, it seems to me, is interdimensionality, unity within plurality, and tolerance and intellectual respect, and ultimately what Spinoza calls the intellectual love of God, which is the duty on the person of wisdom to find the unity, find the Godhead within the diversity. It's like tracking down a herd of cats who've gone astray in the woods. That's the job of the philosopher. If you love God seriously, you want to track the whole herd of cats down and bring them in, because there's a huge storm coming. Or Christ would have used the metaphor of the sheep, like a whole bunch of wild sheep on the fells or mountains of Scotland. What you're doing there is finding within the diversity the unity, and therefore Britain has been a very tolerant home to many Jewish thinkers and savants over the centuries. The problem of modern Zionism and the rebirth of the State of Israel, and the fallout of the challenge of how to solve the problem with Palestine and the Palestinians, I think remains a moral duty for the British people. Personally, I think we should have probably tried to stop World War I ever starting, and the latest evidence shows that King George V may have egged on his foreign minister to get involved in World War I. The thing was a disaster. My mother was born on the 1st of January 1914, and she's got an exhibition on at Brighton Museum as part of a series commemorating 1914 and World War I, and I think the tragedy of that mass slaughter is something that it left everything in shatters. It destroyed the destroyed the Russian Empire, it destroyed the Ottoman Empire, which had kept a sort of harmony in the Middle East, and it destroyed the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had kept a kind of harmony in that part of the world, and the German Empire as well. And nobody really won World War I. But from it came the Balfour Declaration and a British commitment having the mandate for Palestine to create an independent state of Israel, eventually. What I think we need to do now, however, is to help give birth to and create an independent state of Palestine. As in this time, in August 2014, we're seeing a mass bombardment of the people of Gaza who have nowhere to flee to and no hope, and are dying in their hundreds, innocent women and children. And I think the British people could help mediate here, and hopefully bring some common sense to the situation. In my own 19-point peace plan, I proposed that Palestine should be admitted to membership of the Commonwealth as part of its package for becoming an autonomous, independent, sovereign nation, but having sworn peace with Israel. And I think both nations deserve to take their place as mature and responsible nation states among the polity of nations of the world as a whole. And I think if we stay together as a UK, we're more likely to be able to pull that off and help that. And I think we have a bigger moral duty to give birth to a Palestinian state by using whatever influence we have at the United Nations, in the European Union, in the Commonwealth, and so on. than we do if we allow ourselves to be broken up by particular interests into some kind of little, mosaic patchwork, and we'll soon have a little independent Cornwall, independent East Anglia, independent Mercia, independent Wessex, etc. Independent Orkney and Shetland, they'll probably want to break away from Scotland, etc., etc. No, if we stick together as a UK, then I think we've got a chance to pull off some important stuff in the next few years. And this creating of a Palestinian state, not against the interests of Israel, but actually in the best interests of the Jewish people, because most of the Jewish people I know and have spoken to want one thing above all, and that's peace. Shalom is the word they end their prayers with, and they greet you with. I've travelled in Israel. I've met, amazing people in Israel, and have a huge love and respect for Israeli people. But what they need most of all is this gift of peace, which can only come when we give the Palestinians their state on equal terms. It's a paradox. Blake used to say that Britain stood for the very ancient energy, the ancient of days, and all things begin and end on Albion's rocky shore, he said. Well, in a sense, he's right. As a Druid, I would say, yes, he is right. They've now found in Orkney this incredible Nessa Brodga, this ancient temple, which was there thousands of years before, the Temple of Solomon, or before the modern day, religious traditions of the Middle East. So I think from that perspective of that timelessness, I think we should not forget that it was Balfour, was a Scottish aristocrat, who made the declaration saying we should bring into being, or we should help come into being, a Jewish state. Well, I think we need a new Balfour to say, well, okay, fine, you've got it, but let's please also not forget the indigenous people, the Palestinians, their amazing heritage, their Christian, Arabic, Islamic, going right back to the pre-Christian, pre-Islamic times, in a sense the descendants of the original people of Palestine. And the word Palestine goes back to Philistine, and the evidence shows that the Philistine peoples were actually Mycenaean Greeks. They were having similar pottery and art and culture, and it's probable the Mycenaean Greeks had settled along the coastline of Gaza and the Philistine coast. And the legend is that Perseus, the great Mycenaean Greek hero who founded Mycenae, and who rescued Ariadne off a rock outside of Haifa harbour. The legend is that Perseus was actually there on the coast, and that, I think, is a mythological clue as to the true identity of the Palestinian people. And once again, it proves how the Mediterranean people are all interconnected. My point about the Kabbalah runes is that there's no such thing as purely Semitic languages, or purely Greek. Hebrew is Greek, as the great scholar Yehuda pointed out. And so our duty as scholars is to affirm that unity. And that, to me, that was the point of Christ. That was what Christ was trying to teach. If he was alive today, I'm sure, he would be saying, it's to get to that place of unity that all our striving should go. That was the point of saying that's the most important of all the laws. And he would surely want unity between the Jewish people who gave birth to him, who were his nurturing, succouring home, so to speak. And yet his mind was always pushing at the edge. And so, the wider scattered tribes of Israel are, in a sense, the heritage of all mankind now. But I don't see that it would be serving that huge project, which has been going on for thousands of years, which we desperately need to complete, to bring to its completion through peace and reconciliation work. And in that project, my idea of the reopening of the Golden Gate in the east wall of the old city of Jerusalem is central. What I'm saying is, here's this metaphor, this symbol, this blocked up gate, blocked up by the Ottomans, because the Jews wanted their Messiah to come in through that. And the legend says the Messiah will come in and then everyone will live at peace. The Christians say the same. That gate will be open and the Messiah will come through and everyone will live at peace. And it'll be Christ. The Muslims say, yes, that's the gate, that's where he's coming in, but it's going to be Muhammad first and Christ as his assistant. But, Moses too, and Abraham, and what I'm saying is, well, let's open the gate collectively. Let's get a peace treaty signed. Let's get Palestine set up as a state on equal terms with a sworn non-violence treaty with Israel. Let's get a demilitarized agreement. Let's get a railway built between Gaza and the West Bank. Let's get funding aid going in, and let's try love instead of violence. We've tried violence for a very long time. It's not worked. All it does is destroy, maim, cripple and traumatize. Look at the images we see coming from Gaza. Is that the path we want to go down? Let's try love then. Let's reopen this Golden Gate. Let all the great spiritual elders and wisdom keepers of the planet come in through together. The collective Messiah is what's called for. As the Zoroastrians say, the Ser Shant is potentially in all of us once we choose to actualize that. Now this then is, in a sense, going to be helped, this is my argument, more by the United Kingdom as a whole fulfilling its potential destiny, by living up to what we started, and by working with our Jewish community, which are significant and highly intelligent, the chief rabbis and the various leaders of the Jewish community in Britain, and also the Palestinian community in Britain. We have wonderful people from both cultures. When I was running meetings in the House of Lords, I'd invite representatives to come from both sides, and I think we should be doing the same now in London, in Edinburgh, in Glasgow. Let's get discussion, and let's get this peace agreement agreed. I think Palestine can become a member of the Commonwealth, but only if we stay together as a UK can we pull this off, or it's more likely, because otherwise we're going to be totally busy with this whole separation thing. We're going to become like a kind of a dismembered person trying to serve at a dinner table. You can't do it. If we're trying to serve up the banquet of peace, there's no point severing off our different limbs. We need to stay together to deliver the goods. And so from a Jewish perspective and Kabbalistic perspective, I would have thought that keeping the UK together is a good thing. And there have been many esteemed and highly intellectual Jewish thinkers. Now it's interesting that Karl Marx ended up living in Britain, great Jewish philosopher and sage in his own way, and I've written a book about his esoteric influences, Freemasonry in particular. And Marx used to live in Camden, close to where I lived at one point, and taught. Now, Marx was very proud of the fact that his wife was partly descended from a Scottish aristocratic family, the Campbells of Argyll. And when he met his wife to be and courted her, and he knew her father very well in Trier, where he was growing up, he was very proud of the aristocratic Scottish roots of Jenny von Westphalen, who he then married. And I think from a Marxist perspective, and we're going to move on to look at some scientific and humanist arguments, but I think from a Marxist perspective, the keeping nations together to fulfill their real potential, I think, is a beneficial thing. I'm not sure that Marxism as a whole, I suspect my own mother was a Marxist, so I think as an idea it's lost some of its validity, but I think there are some things that Marx said that are still valuable. And my mother always pointed out, look, this is a scientific hypothesis, Thomas. It's not a totalitarian dogmatism that should be enforced militarily on people. And And in that Gramscian sense of humanistic Marxism or Sartrean Marxism, I can resonate with certain aspects and its ideals. And what I discovered in my research is that Marx is probably influenced by the Kabbalah and esoteric philosophy, although he kept it very close to his chest. And what he was saying effectively is that the planet won't reach redemption. We won't get tikkun. We won't get, the solution of all our problems until the poorest classes, until the most deprived, have been raised out of their misery. And he thought that communism was the solution to do that. The problem, of course, is that what happened in state-centred and run communism is that it became an oppressive ideology rather than a liberational one. And it led to pain and suffering and the gulag. I don't think Marx would be a Marxist if he were alive today. His real instinct was about liberation, and he was really a romantic poet. He was a romantic who wanted human freedom and liberation and wisdom. He wanted knowledge, ultimately, to set people free. Now, I don't think... the Labour Party, Ralph Miliband, the father of Ed Miliband, current leader of the Labour Party, was a Marxist intellectual, and from the Jewish community, and a highly intelligent man, taught at the LSE where I used to study and my children went to nursery. There's a profound tradition here which I think still can benefit the people of Britain if it could only live up to its higher formulation. But if you believe in that collective liberation of man, and if you want to call that socialism, I don't think you'd want to call it Marxism, but you might want to call it some kind of socialism or an appreciation of the importance of the amelioration of the worst kind of living conditions for the poorest members of society, then I think you'd want to keep the UK together, because we did have an experiment in socialism. We still do. We have an ongoing relationship with that concept of collective redemption. I don't see why, for example, we can't renationalise the railways. I quite liked British Rail. Why can't I get on a train in Brighton and end up in Inverness and it's all one railway, and I get a cheap deal? Why can't we bring back some aspect of that common sense thing? Why do our energy supplies have to be impossible to comprehend? Why can't we have a nationalised energy industry? I don't see why the infrastructure of our common needs can't be met in that way, and yet totally in harmony with a freeing up of the entrepreneurial spirit of the best aspects of individualism. So I would have thought that from a Marxist perspective, if you split up the United Kingdom, basically you're going to jeopardise that project of collective advancement, and you're going to get a kind of separation of the ways, and I would have thought that that's not in the interest of the country as a whole.